The morning light crept in low and slow, spilling through the gaps in the warped boards of the station platform. Dust rose in lazy swirls beneath the boots of those who'd come early to see the stagecoach unload, their voices carrying in small, sharp bursts. She kept her head down. The brim of her bonnet was frayed, the ribbon limp. The baby swaddled in her arms made no sound, too new to fuss, too tired to cry. Beside her, a barefoot girl of 2 clutched the hem of her skirt with one hand and a limp rag doll with the other, thumb tucked in her mouth, watching the boots and skirts shuffle past. They had walked the last miles into town, her shoes wearing thin, the road dust clinging to her dress in pale streaks. She had not expected kindness here. Towns were all the same, quick to see what you lacked before they saw what you carried. She sat on the edge of the water trough, shifting the newborn against her shoulder. The child's breath was shallow, quick, as if afraid to take too much of the air around her. She pressed her cheek to the small head, trying to will her own warmth into that fragile body. Across the street, a man stood still in the shadow of the livery, his height a head above anyone near him. He was broad through the shoulders, his hat pulled low, one hand resting on the worn rail. His eyes found her through the space between wagons, steady, unreadable, but not cold. There was something in his stance that did not fit the rest of the street's indifference, as if he were holding himself back from crossing over. A woman in a starched bonnet passed, her eyes flicking over the barefoot child, the dust on the mother's skirt. Her mouth pressed thin. "Shame," she muttered, loud enough to be heard. The barefoot girl's hand tightened on the rag doll, her eyes finding her mother's face for explanation. None came. The baby stirred, a faint mule, and the woman's body went rigid. Hunger. Not the kind she could fix, not with the coins rattling loose in her skirt pocket, enough for maybe bread, never for what the child truly needed. The man moved then, slow steps across the street, boots scuffing the dirt. Up close, his shadow fell over her, the width of it blocking the sun. His voice was quiet, carrying more weight than volume. "Ma'am." She looked up only long enough to catch the grief set deep in the lines beside his mouth. His gaze dropped to the newborn, then back to her face. "My wife." He stopped, swallowed. "She passed yesterday. The girl she brought into the world, she's still here. Hungry." It took her a moment to understand. His voice softened further, the words deliberate, careful. "I've been told there's no one in town can feed her. I saw you had a little one of your own. I thought, maybe." Her arms tightened around her own baby. Milk was not something she'd thought she'd be asked to share. Her pride rose fast, what was left of it, but so did the ache in her chest when she pictured a child alone, unfed. The toddler at her side tugged her skirt. "Mama." She looked back at the man. He was not pleading. He simply stood there, waiting, as if whatever answer came, he would accept it. That stillness unnerved her more than if he'd begged. "Show me," she said at last. His eyes flickered, the smallest shift of relief, and he nodded once. She rose, her knees stiff, the baby shifting in her arms. The toddler kept hold of her skirt as they followed him down the side street. The sounds of the main road faded, the iron strike of the blacksmith, the clatter of a wagon wheel, until there was only the crunch of their steps on gravel. They stopped outside a small house, plain boards weathered silver, a porch sagging just enough to give it a weary look. On a cot near the doorway lay a bundle, tiny fists tucked up by her chin, her mouth working silently against the air. The woman knelt, easing the newborn from the blankets. The child was lighter than she expected, the weight barely there. She settled onto the edge of the porch, adjusted her own baby, and drew the stranger's daughter close. The latch was instant, desperate. The man's hands curled into fists and then slowly loosened, his shoulders lowering as he let out a breath. He turned away slightly, perhaps to give her privacy, perhaps to hide the shine in his eyes. The 2-year-old climbed onto the porch beside her mother, setting the rag doll carefully between the babies as if it were an offering. The air held stillness then, not the brittle kind that comes before a storm, but the softer kind that follows a long stretch of noise. When it was done, the woman shifted the child back into her blankets. The man's hands were gentle when he took her, cradling her as though afraid she might vanish. His gaze held hers, searching for something, permission, trust, maybe both. "You've saved her life," he said. Her throat worked, but no answer came. She rose, lifting her own baby, the toddler's hand slipping into hers. She turned to leave, but his voice followed. "I could use help with both girls." She stopped. The street ahead was empty, the sun glinting off the dusty road. Behind her, his words hung in the air, heavy with more than their simple meaning. She did not turn back, not yet. But her grip on her daughter's hand tightened, and the rag doll lay forgotten on the porch between them. The next morning, the light came warmer, spilling across the dirt yard and catching on the dust that hung in the air like breath that wouldn't quite settle. She sat on the porch rail with her two girls, the newborn swaddled and sleeping, the older one swinging her bare feet and tracing patterns in the wood grain. She had meant to leave before the town stirred, but his shadow stretched long across the yard before she could rise. He came with no hat today, the sun striking the tawny strands in his hair, a paper-wrapped bundle in one hand, a water jug in the other. His boots were dusty, his shirt creased at the elbows, and there was a stillness about him that was not tiredness but something else, patience worn smooth. "I figured you hadn't eaten," he said, setting the bundle beside her. Inside was a heel of bread, a slab of cheese, and 2 boiled eggs. The weight of the food in her lap brought a rush of gratitude she didn't want him to see, so she kept her eyes on the bread as she tore it. The older girl took her share without a word, crumbs sticking to her lips. The man didn't sit, but leaned against the porch post, gaze fixed on the horizon as if measuring something out there against what stood in front of him. "How's she?" he asked, nodding to the newborn in her arms. "She's breathing," she said. It was all she could offer without letting the truth leak through. How thin the baby felt, how she'd checked her color in the night more than she slept. He shifted, pushing a breath out slow. "Mine, the one you fed, she cried half the night after you left." His voice caught for a beat before it steadied. "It's been less since she got milk in her. But she'll need more." The request wasn't sharp, just plain, the way a man might speak of the weather. Still, it carried weight. She looked down at her own child, heavy and warm against her, and felt her body tense. Milk was part of her, not something she'd ever thought to give away. Yet she remembered the other child's rooting mouth, the way her tiny fists had trembled, and the ache in the man's eyes as he'd watched. "You're asking me to feed her regular," she said, not a question. "I'm asking," he said simply, "for her life." The porch seemed to still around them, the shifting shadows of the trees, the faint creak of the boards. Her older daughter leaned against her leg, watching him with solemn eyes, as if she already understood the bargain being shaped. Finally she nodded, slow. "Bring her." When he came back with the baby, he carried her as if she were glass, cradled close but not too tight. The child's eyes were shut, lashes dark against skin pale as paper. She made a small noise when he placed her in the woman's arms, and the sound pierced something in her chest. She settled on the porch step, adjusting her own baby to one side and guiding the other to her breast. The latch was quick, hungry, and the rhythm soon steadied into something quiet, almost reverent. The man crouched nearby, forearms braced on his knees, watching with an expression that shifted between relief and something deeper, something he didn't seem ready to name. "She looks stronger already," he murmured. "She just needs time," the woman said, though part of her feared there wasn't much to give. They stayed like that until the child's small body went slack in sleep. She passed her back to him, and his hands cupped the tiny form with the same care he might give a bird that had fallen from its nest. "You've done more than you know," he said, his voice low. She rose, brushing crumbs from her skirt. "Don't thank me yet." He straightened, the baby against his chest. "I will. In my own way." The older girl tugged at her mother's skirt then, holding up the rag doll. "Can she come play at our house?" she asked, glancing at the man. The question made the woman's breath hitch. Us. They didn't have one. Not really. Just walls borrowed from luck or pity until the wind changed. He looked at the child and smiled, the faintest bend of his mouth. "Maybe," he said. When he left, the yard felt quieter, but not emptier. She sat back on the porch rail, chewing the last of the bread, the newborn in her arms stirring. A breeze carried the smell of pine and horses from somewhere beyond the street. She hadn't planned to stay. She hadn't planned for any of this. But as she looked down at her baby, she realized the man's eyes had not been filled with charity. They had been filled with something far rarer on the frontier, recognition. That night, after her daughters had fallen asleep curled against her, she lay awake listening to the slow tick of the clock in the corner, the memory of his voice echoing in her mind. When the knock came at the door just before dawn, she already knew it would be him. The knock was soft but certain, like a man who knew he was welcome enough to wait. She opened the door to find him standing there, the early light painting the dust on his coat a muted gold. In his arms was the infant, bundled in a wool blanket, eyes closed and mouth working in her sleep. "I thought maybe," his words trailed, and instead of finishing, he stepped aside, letting her see the wagon behind him, loaded with a few sacks of grain, a crate of apples, and a narrow wooden cradle with a thin quilt folded inside. She glanced from the load to him. "That's a lot for one feeding." His mouth curved faintly. "It's for more than one." Her chest tightened at the quiet certainty in his tone. He wasn't offering charity. He was making space. By noon, they had walked the mile to his land. It spread wide under a sky that seemed larger than the one above town, the grass bending in waves to the breeze. A weathered cabin stood at the far edge, boards gone silver with age, roof patched with care. She paused at the threshold, her 2-year-old clutching her skirt, the newborn in her arms. "Go on in," he said, pushing the door open. The scent of pine boards and old smoke drifted out. Inside, sunlight angled through the small windows, falling across a table scarred with years of meals and hands. A stone hearth held the faint ghost of a fire. It was spare but clean, and something in her ribs eased without her permission. He set the cradle by the bed, his big hand surprisingly gentle as he tested the rock of it. "This room's yours if you want it. I'll take the loft." Her instinct was to refuse. Rooms came with expectations, always. But the sight of the cradle, empty and waiting, made the word catch in her throat. She lowered her newborn into it, watching her tiny chest rise and fall. The older girl toddled around the cabin, her small fingers brushing the edges of chairs, the cool metal of a tin cup, the smooth handle of a rocking chair. She stopped by the hearth, looking up at the man. "Can we make fire?" He crouched to her level. "Later. When it's dark enough to see it dance." The afternoon passed in a quiet rhythm. She fed his child while her own slept, the sound of the baby's swallowing a soft counterpoint to the creak of floorboards as he moved about, bringing in wood, setting apples in a bowl. He didn't linger over her shoulder, didn't fill the air with questions or instructions. When she finished, he took the baby back, tucking her into the crook of his arm with a tenderness that seemed to slow his whole frame. He sat in the rocking chair, the baby against his chest, eyes on the fireless hearth as if he could already see the flames. She made a simple stew from the grain and apples, the scent filling the small room. It had been months since she'd cooked in a place that didn't feel borrowed. When she set the bowls on the table, he joined her without hesitation, waiting until she sat before lifting his spoon. They ate in companionable silence, broken only by the sound of the older girl humming to herself as she dipped bread into the broth. There was no talk of arrangements or debts. Just the scrape of spoons, the low sigh of wind against the cabin walls, the rare sense that no one here needed to prove their place. After the meal, she stepped onto the porch. The land stretched open before her, the sky wide and unbroken. From here, the town was a faint smudge on the horizon, its voices too far to reach. The quiet wrapped around her, not empty but whole. He joined her, standing with one shoulder against the post. The baby in his arms slept deeply, her small hand curled into his shirt. "You could stay," he said, his tone steady, as though it were neither an order nor a plea. Her fingers tightened on the railing. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." She turned her head toward him. "For what?" His eyes met hers, steady and unflinching. "For all of us to breathe easier." The older girl came out then, tugging at her mother's skirt. "Mama, look." She held a pine cone, cradled in both hands like it was treasure. The woman crouched, brushing a strand of hair from the child's face. "Where'd you find that?" "By the door," the girl said, glancing between them. The man smiled faintly, watching the exchange. "She's already making this place hers." The sun began to sink, laying long shadows across the grass. He lit the fire as promised, and they all sat near it, the children drowsy, the air warm with the scent of pine resin. Later, when she carried her daughters to the bed and returned to the hearth, she found him still in the rocking chair, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Why me?" she asked quietly. He didn't look up. "Because you didn't look away." The fire popped softly. She felt the weight of his words settle over her, not heavy, but sure like the roof above them. When she finally went to bed, the cradle was between her and the wall, both babies breathing in the same slow rhythm. She lay awake, listening to it. In the loft above, a floorboard creaked. Then his voice, low in the dark, carrying just enough for her to hear. "This feels like the first right thing since she died." The days began to fall into a rhythm so gentle it almost startled her. Morning light would slip through the warped cabin window, touching the quilt where both babies slept. She would wake to the sound of the 2-year-old padding barefoot across the floor, her small hand brushing her mother's arm before reaching for the rag doll. Somewhere outside, the slow scrape of a shovel or the thud of an axe told her he was already working. It was the children who first broke the invisible wall between them. His daughter, though too small to know the difference, seemed to sense when she was near, fussing until she was placed in her arms. Her own daughter took to shadowing him as he worked, her little fingers tracing the smooth grain of the porch railing while she peppered him with questions in the only way toddlers could, by pointing and naming things, demanding his agreement. "Horse," she'd say. "Fence. Hat." Each word was met with a nod or the faintest smile. One afternoon, she found the two girls lying side by side on a folded blanket in the yard, their tiny hands touching, their breathing synced. He stood a few feet away, leaning on a post, watching them as if they were the only thing worth seeing. She realized then that his gaze was not the sharp, measuring look of someone deciding if you belonged. It was the quiet regard of a man who had already decided you did. Meals became shared without discussion. She would cook, he would fetch wood or water. The older girl began handing him spoons and bowls as if she'd always done it. Sometimes he'd set the babies in their cradle side by side while the three of them ate, and she'd catch herself watching him, not for what he was doing, but for how he moved, the way he slowed down near the children, the way his big hands never seemed clumsy when they lifted something fragile. On the fourth day, she found a pair of small leather shoes on the bed where her daughter slept. The stitching was worn but careful, the soles patched. She turned them over in her hands, wondering when he'd slipped them there. That evening, the girl wore them to the table, kicking her feet under the bench with pride. Later, while the fire snapped in the hearth, he sat carving a thin strip of wood, smoothing its edges with the back of his knife. "My father used to make toys for us," he said quietly, not looking up. "Said a child's hands should always have something good to hold." He placed the finished piece on the table, a small wooden horse, simple but solid. The older girl picked it up, tracing its shape with her fingers before pressing it to her chest. Her heart caught at the sight. No one had ever made her daughter something just to make it. No price, no bargain, no debt. That night, as she nursed both babies in turn, the older girl climbed into his lap with the wooden horse and began to hum. He didn't move her, didn't hush her. His gaze met hers across the firelight, and something unspoken passed between them, something that felt like the first plank in a bridge neither of them had planned to build. But the world beyond the cabin hadn't gone quiet. On a trip into town for flour, she caught the stares. Two women leaned close to each other outside the mercantile, their eyes flicking from her to the man unloading grain from his wagon. A man at the hitching post spat into the dust, muttering just loud enough, "Strays always find each other." She kept her chin high, but the words followed her all the way back to the wagon. He didn't speak until they'd left the last building behind. "You don't have to listen to them." "I've heard worse," she said. He glanced at her, then back to the road. "Still shouldn't have to." The cabin felt warmer than usual when they returned, the babies fussing until they were in her arms. She fed them, his gaze steady from the hearth. The older girl handed him the wooden horse before climbing into her mother's lap, as if making sure he'd keep it safe until morning. That evening, the two of them sat on the porch while the children slept. The air smelled of pine and cooling earth. He turned the wooden horse over in his hands before setting it on the rail between them. "I can't give them everything," he said, voice low. "But I can give them this, a place no one can take from them." She looked at the horse, then at him. "And me." His eyes held hers for a long moment, something steady and unfinished in them. "I'm still figuring what I can give you." The quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighty, the kind that seemed to settle in your bones. Somewhere inside, a baby stirred, and the sound drew them both to their feet. When she reached the cradle, the newborns were sleeping side by side again, their small hands clasped in a way neither of them could have arranged. She stood there, watching the rise and fall of their chests, until she felt him step up behind her. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Looks like they already decided for us." The smell of simmering tomatoes and garlic filled the cabin, mingling with the low crackle of the fire. She stirred the pot slowly, watching the steam curl upward like breath in cold air. The table had been cleared and scrubbed, two wooden bowls set at one end, smaller tin cups beside them. Outside, the sun slid lower, the shadows of the pines reaching long across the yard. He came in without a word, carrying the last of the chopped wood. His shirt was damp at the collar, his hands rough with the day's work. He set the wood by the hearth, then paused, eyes falling on the table. "Smells like a feast," he said, though his tone carried something deeper, quiet surprise, almost gratitude. She didn't turn, only ladled sauce into a bowl, then set another beside it. "It's not much," she replied. "Just something different." The 2-year-old darted in from the porch, her shoes scuffed with dirt, clutching the wooden horse in one hand. She climbed into her chair as if she'd been waiting for this moment all day. In the cradle near the hearth, the two newborns shifted, their small sounds threading into the room's warmth. He sat opposite her, filling the space with his presence but not pressing against it. The pasta was plain, the sauce simple, but he ate slowly, as if memorizing the taste. Between them, the table seemed smaller than usual, their hands sometimes brushing when they reached for bread. Halfway through the meal, he set down his fork and leaned back. "I've been thinking," he said, his gaze steady, "about how this works. About us." Her pulse stumbled. The air seemed to thicken. "And His eyes dropped briefly to the bowls, then back to her. "I can't raise these girls halfway. I can't be just the man who brings food or cuts wood. If you stay, it has to mean something more." She swallowed, setting her fork down. "And if I can't give you more?" "You already have," he said. "But I'd ask for your hand all the same." The fire popped, startling one of the babies into a soft cry. She rose instinctively, lifting the child to her shoulder, rocking gently. He watched her, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped as if holding himself still against some urge. "I've buried one wife," he continued quietly. "Didn't think I'd ever speak those words again. But I look at you, and it's not the same as before. It's not replacing. It's building something new." Her throat tightened. "The town will talk." "They already do," he said. "But they don't get a seat at this table." The 2-year-old was humming now, dragging the wooden horse along the table's edge. The sound was light, unbothered. The baby in her arms sighed and settled again. She looked from one child to the other, then at him. "You'd have me for my milk," she said softly. His jaw tightened, but his voice was steady. "I'd have you because you didn't turn away. From her. From me." Silence folded over them, broken only by the faint hiss of the pot cooling on the stove. The words hung in the air, waiting. She could feel the ground shifting under her feet, dangerous, but steady in a way she hadn't felt in years. Finally, she nodded once. "Then ask me properly." He rose, the chair legs scraping against the floor. Crossing to her, he stood close enough that she could smell the faint scent of pine smoke on his shirt. "Will you marry me?" Her answer was a whisper, but it carried. "Yes." Something in his shoulders eased, though he didn't touch her, as if holding the moment between them without breaking it. The older girl clapped her hands, not knowing why but sensing something had changed. He gave a short laugh, the first she'd heard from him that wasn't just air in his chest. "Then it's settled," he said. They finished the meal with the ease of people who had stepped over a threshold they could never unstep. The children drifted toward sleep, the fire burning low. He washed the bowls while she set the babies in the cradle side by side, their small hands finding each other even in dreams. When she turned back, he was standing at the table, looking at it as if seeing it for the first time. "It's not a mansion," he said quietly. "But it's ours." She crossed to him, resting her hand lightly on the table's worn edge. "Homes aren't built from walls," she said. "They're built from moments like this." He looked at her then, not with hunger, not with pity, but with a steady recognition she had first seen in the street. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain that would come by morning. Inside, the cabin held its warmth, the fire's glow reaching across the floor to touch them both. It wasn't the grand moment some might expect. No music, no crowd, no preacher's voice. Just spaghetti on a wooden table, 2 children dreaming in the corner, and the knowledge that they had chosen each other without needing to be rescued. The newborns shifted again, and her gaze followed them, softer now, certain. When she looked back, he was still watching her. Maybe that was the answer she'd been waiting to give all along. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. Please subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.